I come here on behalf of my entire family to give you our deepest thanks.
Well, for what?
For what? For saving Don Hector's life. I just visited him. You know, seeing a man like that, can't speak, can barely move. I wanted to weep. But it could have been worse. Varga tells me that while everybody else was picking their asses, you rushed to him, struck him on the chest, and brought him back.
It was simple instinct.
But still, with all the history between you two, what you did was a gesture of peace. Or at least that's how we see it.
I'm very pleased to hear that.
Now let me ask y'all a question. If you were to be pinned down onto the ground and forced to watch someone shoot the love of your life in the back of the head, do you ever think that not only would you be able to forgive the person who did it, but also several years down the line choose to save their life over watching them die a horrible death? Yeah, no would have been the obvious answer. And unlike many characters in the show, Lalo understands this, which is why in his first encounter with Gus he tries figuring out just why the hell he decides to save Hector's life, and also pay for all of his treatment, which Lalo more than likely deduced prior to making his way to Albuquerque. Now Gus manages to do a decent enough job at shrugging this off when he tells Lalo it was just simple instinct. But unlike Juan Bosa, who shuts down the idea of Gus being vengeful at every turn.
No entiendes a Gustavo. Con él, todo es negocio.
¿Todo es negocio? Como lo que pasó en Santiago, eso también es negocio.
Lalo sees past this. Now, unfortunately for Lalo, Gus is one of the only characters on the show that he really struggles to pick up a read on. And when he visits people like Jimmy and Mike, he's almost instantly able to understand what they're thinking. As a character who is either always too stoic or panicky under pressure, start to become much more predictable the longer you're around them. But Gus isn't either of these. As you'll notice in almost all the scenes where Gus is under any amount of pressure, he reveals nothing.
Salud.
Salud. Now, one mistake Lalo does make, which is fairly consistent, is the fact that he willingly lets people know that he is on to them. Such as the time where he decided to tell Gus that he knew about the concrete wall being built, simply because of the fact that he understands the power he possesses, meaning that he knows Gus won't be able to act on the information he's just given him, or at least that's what he thinks. Now, Gus's reaction to this information and what he and Mike thought to be a good enough plan of action was to simply just shut down all construction on a super lab until Lalo
is dealt with, and he will be dealt with. Construction will resume.
But here's the problem with that. At the beginning of your conversation with Mike, you discussed the near dozen civilians that know about this super lab. People who you and your men aren't able to watch over. People who Lalo are free to interrogate. Now, for a man as cautious and attentive as Gus is, you would think that Lalo, knowing Werner Ziegler's name, would be a problem that you should immediately be dealing with. Seemingly as though tracking down and questioning Mrs. Ziegler clearly isn't the most difficult of tasks. But luckily for Lalo, Gus overlooks this small detail, ultimately leading up to Lalo's discovery of the super lab. Now, in all fairness, Gus actually did put together a rather foolproof plan when it came to dealing with this, which was to get Mike to act as a PI in order to get Lalo arrested, and then later hire Jimmy to free Lalo of his charges, all in the hope that once out of jail, Lalo would immediately retreat back to Mexico, where the Sicarios Gus hired can take Lalo out. And because this murder would take place in Mexico, suspicion of Gus being the one behind the hit would be minimal, as a murder in the South is far less suspicious than a murder in the North. But we all know how this played out. Now, to me, this was the moment where I really started to consider Lalo to be intellectually superior to Gus, as the ability this guy has when it comes to forward thinking, in my opinion, is unparalleled. Straight after almost being butchered in his own home, Lalo instantaneously realizes what he has to do, which is fake his own death in order to make discovering the super lab much easier. And the fact that Lalo is the type of character to have two innocent souls unknowingly on standby in the case of an event like this, all make him arguably the most dangerous foe in the entire series, as defeating a man who is intellectually and physically superior to you and has absolutely no moral qualms you could potentially use against him is, in every sense of the word, unbeatable. Now, Lalo is undoubtedly the only Salamanca smart enough to take this approach, as two Golda cousins and Hector would almost immediately go to war after figuring out that Gus had tried to have them killed. But once again, I do have to give credit where credit is due, as Gus's intuitive ability to understand what a person is thinking just by looking at them is also unparalleled, as when he visits Hector after thinking he killed Lalo, he realizes just off a look that Lalo is actually still alive. Now, I do have to point this out, as Hector, the smug bell-ringing bitch, does make this painfully obvious, which ultimately fucks up the majority of Lalo's plan. However, I do have to give Hector some credit, as Lalo did need his advice on what to do next. So ultimately, they both kind of fucked each other. Point and shoot. Now, I have many problems with this episode, and seeing as though it's meant to be Better Call Saul's version of Breaking Bad's Face Off, it didn't really live up to the expectation. See, besides all the plot contrivances in this episode, the main problem I have is that in order for Gus to kill Lalo, the creators felt like they had no other choice but to dumb Lalo down, by making him allow Gus to slander his entire family, for which Lalo thought be a great idea to get on video for some reason, which becomes increasingly more nonsensical when you take into account the fact that a season earlier, Mike directly stated that Lalo was the type of guy just to kill you on the spot. So I have no idea why he plays along with Gus's painfully obvious stalling, especially when he knows that Mike and Tyrus are bound to arrive there any minute. Now, in Breaking Bad, they didn't have to do this, or at least were smart enough to figure out a way around it. Walter White used his connections with Saul and Jesse to find out Gus's one major weakness, which was his connection to Hector, and exploit it. But in Point and Shoot, Gus doesn't do that. Several episodes prior, he just places a gun in the super lab in hopes that he and Lalo would just conveniently find themselves there, and pray that in the 4 to 5 seconds it's going to take you to run across the room, Lalo doesn't manage to hit you with any meaningful shots, which in my eyes is just an underwhelming climax to an otherwise amazing rivalry. Now, after all of this occurs, Gus is invited to Don Eladio's villa for questioning, where Hector accuses him of...
El atentado contra mi sobrino en su hacienda falló. Lalo le ganó a los asesinos. El día después del ataque, Lalo me llamó. Escuché la verdad de sus propios labios. Fue Fring quien mandó a los asesinos, no los peruanos. Mantuvimos en secreto que Lalo sobrevivió. Mi sobrino estaba a punto de vengarse del traidor, frente a frente, pero desapareció. Esto fue obra del pollero. Don Eladio, mire a Fring a los ojos. Allí verá la verdad. El pollero lo odia. Es nuestro enemigo. Él conspira en contra de nosotros. Yo exijo sangre por sangre.
Now, I know I said earlier Lalo's ability to forward think was unparalleled, which I still believe to be true, seeming as though the majority of the time he was doing everything alone. But I have to give Gus credit here. The fact that he was able to cover everything up and make it out as if he had nothing to do with Lalo's death was genius. However, all to the aid of Juan Bosa, who up until his death still couldn't get a proper read on Gus and his true motivations. Unlike Hector and Lalo, who I think definitely deserve to be in the conversation when it comes to the most intelligent characters in the Breaking Bad universe. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications. And let me know down in the comments what other videos you'd like to see. Peace.